All right, good evening, guys. We'll get started with our review session. Let me see if I can get that light to move out of the way. Good evening. Hopefully Sunday's going well for you guys. With our review session, I've got a list of questions that are already on today's meet. If you want to add any more while the review session is going on, that's absolutely fine. But we'll just jump into it with chapters 5 and 6. Test tomorrow is going to be 50 questions, all multiple choice, checking to see your factual knowledge and how you're doing with the content that you guys were supposed to pick up from those chapters. So I'll just run through the questions as they were asked starting earlier this afternoon. And again, please feel free to jump in with any sort of follow-up questions or whatever that I can help out with. So the first question was asking about explain the Great Awakening and how Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield contributed to it. When you study the Great Awakening, it's key that you're paying attention to the fact that this is a religious movement that is changing the way that religion has been working inside the United States. You've got preachers who are traveling from town to town, so they're described as being itinerant preachers, which means they don't have a stable home church. They instead travel from place to place trying to stir up people's emotions about religion. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield are two of the leading people who are traveling. Most famous is Jonathan Edwards with his speech, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it's going to be that speech that is going to be something that takes off throughout the colonies. And it's convincing a lot of people that they should think twice about their religion. And it's going to split the religion into two groups. Old lights who are inspired with their religion, but they want to hold on to the old ways of doing things. And new lights who are going to be rethinking religion, trying to take it a different direction than what the older people have been doing previously. And they mentioned for you in your textbook that causes a division in the church. You're allowed to challenge the authority of the church. It's a very different sort of church structure now that the churches have been weakened by over a century of living here in the New World. So instead of like burning people or hanging them or crushing them or holding a Salem witch trial, instead the church is split and they create new universities to help train new preachers who can preach not just to the old style, but also to the new. That flourishing of universities up, especially in the northern part of the United States, is going to encourage a lot of people to rethink education, become more literate and educated with thinkers, and it's going to cause that combination with the Enlightenment to be influential in the revolution that's going to be coming soon. What was the Paxton Boy movement and why was that important? We discussed both the Paxton Boys and also the Regulators, one in Pennsylvania, one down in the Carolinas, and both of them were unhappy about their opportunities, their struggles out in the frontier, and particularly they weren't big fans of Indians and they wanted to move them out of the way, and they felt threatened by both the Indians and also the people who were elite on the coast, who weren't doing very much to look out for their cares because they were seen as the lowest class of people in society. And so you put all that stuff together and you have people who are taking the law into their own hands to try to create something for their own on the frontier in challenge to what the authority on the coast wants them to be able to be doing. Next question is, what was the Molasses Act? The Molasses Act in 1733 is going to be a law that's created trying to figure out a way to put taxes on foreign sources of molasses. And it's an English scheme to try to figure out ways to get more colonists to buy more British molasses. Originally, the Dutch molasses would be cheaper, but if they could put a tax onto Dutch molasses and make it more expensive than the British molasses, then they'd be buying more stuff from British sources. So it's trying to recognize the fact that the colonists are trying to work with other countries, and this is an example of mercantilism, the king trying to drive all trade through his country so that the colonies are making gold for the king himself. And trying to guide all trade to go through the London area. Let me see here. What was the American Enlightenment? The American Enlightenment is a movement that's feeding from the European Enlightenment, and so that's a period of scientific thought over in Europe where people believe that when you think about the universe and how it was created, they have a very different take on religion than what previously had been going on with, let's say, the Puritans. And so instead of thinking about God as being somebody who's on a throne with lightning bolts ready to smite people, their version of God was more like a prime mover. The way that they would describe it is imagine a pool table where they racked up the balls, and if you start a game of pool, you take your cue and you hit the cue ball into the whole racked up set of balls, and they start shooting all over the place. When Enlightenment people started thinking about religion, they could explain everything in the universe, and they usually could do it mathematically. Eclipses work this way, we circle the sun this way. The one thing they couldn't explain is, where did this all come from first? Where did everything start in motion? You put a body in motion, it's going to stay in motion. But the question that they couldn't figure out is, where did this all come from originally? And so in their scheme, they needed to figure out a prime mover to get everything in the universe going. And that's what they see God as being. They also believe that there are rules on the universe, so that if you are somebody who is a deep thinker and examining the universe, they believe that you can come closer to God not just through prayer, but also through scientific thought and reason. And so they believe that God, as a prime mover, set the whole universe to a mathematical set of formulas, and if you think deeply about it, you can figure those out. The key thing then is the idea that they believe that you can make things perfect, or at least more perfect, in our world. That's why they discuss with the Constitution that they want to create a more perfect union, where they're talking about the idea of trying to elevate government to something new and enlightened compared to what it had been previously. Let me see here. Can you explain the upper house and lower house in the government of the colonies? I'm not really sure what you're referring to with that, because in these chapters there is no upper house and lower house of the colonies. There's an upper and lower house in England, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. That's what's known as a bicameral legislature, or a two-house legislature. Eventually the United States and many colonies and states are going to adopt that as their own thing. So like in the state of Minnesota, they have a House and a Senate, just like we do in the United States. But if you could clarify that question, I'm not certain what direction you're going with that. We have a number of questions asking about why was King William's War and Queen Anne's War and the other wars overseas, how were those important? And what I'd like to point out to you is this. Let me jump over here. Wars that started in Europe. And so when they drifted over here to the New World, the key that we need to focus on is these are caused by issues in Europe. They're going to be very much not the big deal that's happening here inside of our course. And then we're going to have a equal reaction that's happening, where we're going to be expected to fight wars here in the Americas. But the key is, after the war is done, England and France treat gains or losses here in the New World as very much less important than what's happening over in Europe. That's going to cause them then to trade back and forth the stuff that was lost during the wars. And for the colonists, they're going to feel betrayed because of the fact that what they fought for has been denied them. Next question was asking about the edict. And let me show you this. Again, super simple, and in fact, they'll just give you a blurb like this one that talks about how this edict that was created was created by the French, and it gave the Huguenots, those Calvinists in France, rights inside the nation, even though the nation was largely Catholic. And so again, not to discourage you from asking those sorts of questions, but these are like the lowest level questions, where if you do need that sort of help, I wouldn't wait until Sunday night beforehand. You can either email me or else look online. But those are kind of the basic ones that hopefully you can use those resources to ease your mind a little bit earlier in the week. I've got a question from Max. What was worst, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre or the St. Louis Cardinals playoff run? Just for Max tonight, I decided to wear my 2006 St. Louis Cardinals fleece. It's getting kind of warm in here, though. I mean, it's tough. I mean, whoa, hold on, what's that? Oh, that's a 2011 St. Louis Cardinals World Championship T-shirt. I'm feeling all right about the Cardinals. Half game out, playing the Cubs tonight. They're playing meaningful baseball in the fall. The Twins aren't. Sorry. Max, I know you're rooting for who's in first place, whichever team is in first place. So I wish I could be you, because I mean, your team is doing pretty good, whichever team it is. So next person. Please explain old lights and new lights. We discussed that with the First Great Awakening. And by the way, Max, I'm not trying to rag on you. You're fine. First Great Awakening had the old lights and new lights. Old lights are going to be the people who want to stick with their old religion. New lights are going to be the ones who are split by the itinerant preachers who are bringing around their religion to other places. Next question was, why was it essential to capture Louisbourg before Quebec? When you take a look at a map of Louisbourg, and let me show it to you like right here. The fortress that you have at Louisbourg is going to be in a very strategic location, and so they've got this location out here, and it's going to be very much a guarding point for anybody who wants to go into or out of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So if you want to get into that river that leads into French territory, that fort is going to have to be conquered in order for people to be able to move up there. That's why it becomes such an essential target for the British, because they want to make sure that they're able to close off the St. Lawrence River so the French can't get any sort of supplies, and then they're going to end up losing the war. Who was William Pitt, and what did he do? He was the Prime Minister of England during the French and Indian War, and his important thing was he focused his war effort on America instead of over in Europe like they'd done in previous wars. So the French and Indian War, like we mentioned in class, is the key important war to notice in your Chapter 6, because it's going to be the one that ends the French as a threat in the New World, and the British will then have full control over the North American continent. Next question says, what was the proclamation the London government issued? Why is this important? It's called Proclamation Line of 1763. This is crucial because it's going to be drawn by a king as a line that's going north and south along the Appalachian Mountains, and it's going to be stopping any colonists from moving into the new territory that was gained during the French and Indian War. When that land was gained, you're going to be losing that land as a settling point, because the king is going to make it off limits to the colonists. Even though the colonists were the ones who ended up winning the war, they feel like they're frozen out of any sort of land that could possibly get them to a better spot. So hopefully that helps out. Next question. Will there be any questions on this test from previous chapters? No, these are all going to be devoted to the 2 chapters that you're reading currently in class. They're going to be ones, we're going to focus on about 25 questions per chapter. Eventually, we're going to get to the point where I start including also new format multiple choice questions, but we're not to that spot yet. I'm just worried about getting your content tight so that when we start writing again, we're going to be doing more writing this week, and I'd like to be able to write intelligently about what you guys have read in chapters 5 and 6. Let me see. Next question. Can you briefly explain the major importance of the French and Indian War? How did it drastically affect the British? I think, Claire, we just hit on that with the idea that and that's going to be something that's going to be really hard for them to then overcome. Were all of the colleges, schools established on the idea of educating boys and preparing for the ministry? Were they mainly not first sons? That's going a little bit too far. The universities they very much feel like if you've got a calling to the ministry, that's the direction you should go. They're also very much not like letting every kid into the ministry. So you've got a ton of people who are farmers who are not going to be going off to university. This is for like the best and the brightest, the people who are looking for additional training. They could be firstborn sons. They don't have to be. And so you're going to see as we move through the 1700s, the idea of primogeniture becomes less and less important to many Americans because they start moving away from that sort of thought process. And in fact, around the time of the Revolution, that's going to fade out as an official measure of handing stuff down inside the United States. Let me see here. Did experts ever take younger sons on as apprentices? Would they later take up this expertise? Could they have taken? Could they have this over being a laborer? Sure. this is a place where you have a lot of people who are moving up through society through apprenticeships and just demonstrating skill. And as far as like the firstborn son thing, be careful with that, because it's something we discussed as far as like inheritance rights when giving away land. But as far as opportunities, it's not like these people looked at the second-born son as a piece of trash and didn't do anything for them. It's just that when they died, the money control turned over to the eldest son if primogeniture was kicking in, and that's where it could turn pretty cold-hearted. But it's not like these fathers are saying to the second-born son, go out on your own and figure out everything on your own. They're doing things to help out all of their kids because they love them. Was there any lasting effects of the Zenger trial? The Zenger trial is going to be important in U.S. history because it emphasizes the idea of freedom of speech inside the freedom of the press. And so with that, you're going to have a lot of Americans who are expecting that as a freedom they should be able to have, and it's eventually going to get written in the Bill of Rights as a protection that they want to be able to maintain. What caused the middle ground to dissolve? The middle ground dissolved because the French were not there to be the other half of the sandwich that you have separating the British and the French. So when the French aren't there to protect the Indians when the British are being mean to them, then the British can do whatever they want to the Indians on the frontier. Eventually what's going to happen is the British are going to be controlling Canada, the central part of the United States, and then the revolution is going to be taking place where the colonists try to separate. So we're going to see a middle ground emerging again, where the Native Americans are going to have to decide, do they ally with the colonists or do they ally with the British? A lot of them choose the British because compared to the colonists, anybody looks good, because colonists aren't really being all that nice or respectful to the Indians. When the British lose the American Revolution, again, the Native Americans will lose that middle ground, and they'll find some pretty aggressive colonists who don't want to work with the Native Americans once the Revolution is finished. When the Scotch-Irish came to Pennsylvania, were they punished in any way? They were mistreated as second-class citizens. And so just like we nowadays have a battle going on about like Mexican immigrants, should they come over, learn the language, fit in culturally, and so on, the same thing was expected of the Scotch-Irish, to fit in, try to fit in with the dominant culture. But the expectation was also, if you're Scotch-Irish, you're never going to be an equal citizen with the British, because they still look down on you genetically, even if you do accept all of the cultures and practices. So a lot of the Scotch-Irish are moving to the deep backcountry to try to find a safe place to live. Next question says, on page 106, there's a chart, 9 world wars. I don't get where there's one column labeled Europe and one labeled America. Are they the same wars? They are the same wars, but they're named differently because in world and European history, they're going to be given a name by the people who are living over in that part of the world. In America, they're going to be given a different name because of the fact that they're an extension of those wars, but they have their own character and culture to them. So like if you hear about the 7 Years' War, it's the same thing as the French and Indian War, depending on if you're talking to the British or the French or the Americans. And so that's why you've got those different terminologies in there. It's less meaningful for you guys because of the fact that you haven't taken world history yet, but next year you're going to be in world history. They'll be mentioning a bunch of these wars about like Austrian succession and whatever, and next year your teachers will be reminding you that this is like the equivalent of this American war that you've already learned about in our class. Can I explain Pontiac's uprising and how that affected the colonies? So you've got a group of Native Americans on the western frontier, and when I say western frontier at this time, it means from the Appalachian Mountains out to the Mississippi River. And so in that area, you've got a group of Indians who are not really friendly to the colonists. They've been supported by the French to be angry at the British. And so when the colonists start moving across the frontier, Pontiac is able to mobilize a united front to be able to attack the colonists when they move into the new territory. It's part of the reason for the proclamation line of 1763 to keep the colonists safe, because the king isn't ready to devote new resources out in the western frontier to defend the Native Americans. But for the colonists, they're thinking that they could probably eliminate Pontiac and take over that land next to the Ohio River so they become rich and take advantage of that opportunity. Can I explain more about the triangular trade? I'm not sure what confusion you're having with that because the question is pretty vague, but it's that trade that's happening between the Americas, England, Africa, the Dutch West Indies, and you're going to have a series of products that are moving across the ocean, oftentimes in a series of moves to try to turn products into slaves that are moving over to the New World. One of the most famous ones is taking molasses from the Caribbean, moving it up the coast, turning it into rum, then sending it across the ocean to trade the rum for slaves. and then to bring them back to be able to continue that trade over and over again across the ocean. It's that triangular trade that the British are trying to take advantage of with mercantilism, where they're trying to figure out ways to sink their hooks into as much of that money as possible, because they see that money is being made, but a lot of times the colonists are smuggling around the British rules, and so a lot of times that money is escaping the British system instead of being captured inside of it. Next question says, can I explain the Molasses Act? We've already done that, talking about how that's a scheme the British cook up to try to put taxes on Dutch products to make English molasses look more appealing. We've already discussed the Enlightenment movement. Explain how North American colonists tried to decrease the transatlantic slave trade. I'm not sure I understand where that question is coming from. What you're going to find inside your textbook is a discussion instead about how, with natural reproduction, the North American slave trade is going to be less robust than in other places, because the colonists are going to be treating their slaves in a way where they're going to be having a lot of children to work on those plantations, and as a result, they can feed their needs internally with childbirth rather than depending exclusively on trade from overseas. When you take a look at slave trade to other places, like in the Caribbean, Central America, South America, there's so much mistreatment, so many bad diseases. Think like starving time in the early 1600s, and you get a good idea of that. There's going to be a need to keep resupplying the slaves, because it is such a dangerous place to be alive, much less a slave who's being mistreated. Why do homeless people wear a large red P? I need a lot more to figure out where that question's coming from. I didn't even remember reading that about that in the textbook. I can guarantee you it's not going to be a huge thing on the textbook. On your textbook test. And so if you want to follow up with that, I'd love to be able to figure out what that is. If you got a page number or something like that, let me know. How did the 7 Years' War start and end? So French and Indian War got started when General Braddock went stumbling into the Ohio River Valley, which was French territory, and he was ambushed and slaughtered and killed. And then we also had George Washington, who also got attacked with colonists under his command, and they were forced to retreat. And so this incident is going to be a leading reason why you have war breakout here in the Americas between the British and the French, although there have been tons of tension going on over in Europe about the same thing. The French and Indian War is going to come to an end because William Pitt is going to concentrate his forces, instead of just being in Europe, he's going to devote a large amount of his navy and his army to come over here and end the French once and for all as a threat. And so they close up the St. Lawrence Seaway. That's the Louisbourg fort that we were taking a look at. He's going to conquer Quebec. He's going to conquer Fort Duquesne on the Ohio River, and it'll eventually be renamed Pittsburgh in honor of his attention to the war here. And so eventually the French run out of interest in the war, they run out of supporters, and they can't get their supplies past the naval blockade that the British built up, and so the war is going to come to an end. Can I explain more about the Huguenots? The Huguenots were Protestants. They were Calvinists in France, and they were not getting along with the people who were here over there in France because of the fact that their religion was so much different than the Catholicism that they were practicing. And so the Huguenots are another group of Calvinists, kind of like the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who are going to come over here to the New World to practice their faith. And so it's another group of religious exiles who are coming for freedom. Can I explain why the French and Indian War is what it was? First of all, I think we got that pretty well. Why it's called the French and Indian War, it's the French and their Native American allies versus the British, the colonists, and their Native American allies. So it's just describing who the British and the colonists see as their major enemies. Next question, what is the difference between royal and proprietary colonies? A proprietorship is a business. It's an ownership. So if you were like the sole proprietor of a business, you would be the owner of that business who is running it on a day-to-day basis. So when you think about like the Jamestown Joint Stock Company experience, you've got a proprietorship. They are being built up as a money-making scheme for people who are investing back at home. When a colony becomes a royal colony, it's not owned by a joint stock company. It's owned by the king. He's got a royal governor there, and so they're going to be governed as a royal colony rather than as a business venture that's being run by a company back home. Can I explain the different government types in the colonies and how that affected the colonies differently? We discussed how in the early colonial experience, the House of Burgesses was created in Virginia, which is something that became an inspiration for almost every colony to start building up its assembly systems in the 16 and early 1700s. So they're going to build legislatures so that they can govern themselves, much like Virginia did. You also saw with like the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the colonists loved the idea of writing their own specific set of rules. So they've got a charter from the king already. That is their document that says while they're living here in the New World, here are the rules that you must obey in the spot that are special to you because of your special mission. And then they oftentimes will create a charter, a set of rules themselves that have rules that are really difficult to change so that everybody's treated equally inside the colony. Those two elements, the written constitution and the creation of a legislature, is so important to them that a lot of colonies will then mimic that. And as we create like the American Revolution, a lot of people will create their own new governments for states and eventually the United States government that will model after that. Let's see here. Why was the ethnic diversity in the colonies significant? I'm building up for you something that's going to be huge in the next few chapters. So the reason why the ethnic and religious diversity is so key in this chapter is notice the failure of the Albany Congress, where you've got this idea from Ben Franklin to create this united front here in the Americas to protect all the colonies by working together. And while the king shot it down because he didn't want to give away independence, for all these colonies, they were saying, we don't like our neighbors. We're very much okay with how we're governing ourselves. And it's that ethnic and racial and religious diversity that they're going to need to overcome 20 years later when they fight the American Revolution, because we have this vision of them as all being founding fathers, all being united. When John Adams was asked after the war was done with the American Revolution, what was the split? He claimed that there was a third of the country that were patriots, a third of them were loyal to the king, and a third of them really didn't care at all about the war. They just wanted to go on with their daily lives. That's not a scientific measure. I mean, he didn't actually go out and tally that, but it's just an approximation that shows you that when the war comes, you've got a problem initially that you're fighting enemies here at home, and apathy, kind of like you saw with the Dutch in New Amsterdam when the British came, where there are people here who don't really care one way or the other about the revolution because they just want to keep farming in the backwater with the independence that they've had for the longest time. They don't really feel threatened. And so that's what we're building up towards, is that idea that when we do get to the revolution, enough people are going to be united behind the idea that they hate the king, that they will be able to stage a successful revolution to get independence from the British. Can I explain the Proclamation of 1763 and why it's so important? We discussed that boundary line that was moving out west. Hopefully, Team Iron Man or Team Captain America? I love Team Cap. I mean, how could you not? I mean, really, this guy, he's friends with Bucky, and Bucky, he didn't do anything wrong. He was a prisoner of war who was brainwashed by dirty communist Russians and Hydra. I mean, he was forced to do stuff against his will, including killing Howard Stark, which he never would have done. And like he said during that Civil War movie, it haunts him constantly that he's going through that. I think Iron Man is being very short-sighted, especially since he's trying to regulate all these people, but he keeps building the things that keep threatening to blow up the world, like Killian and Ultron. And I mean, it's hands down. I mean, Cap's a good guy, and my daughter tells me he's boss, and so whatever that means, that's good. Can I explain more about General Braddock? General Braddock is a leading general for the British, but he stumbles into that ambush in the Ohio River Valley that is going to start the French and Indian War. In what ways were the French, Spanish, and Indians affected? I'm assuming this is from the French and Indian War. French are going to lose any claim to the New World. They're still going to have fur traders here, but they're going to be operating under British control. The Spanish are still going to maintain their territorial claims, but they're pretty weak after the failure of the Spanish Armada, and so they're very fearful of what the British Navy could do to them. And so they're allowed to maintain their colonies, but they're not as strong as they would want to be here in the Americas. The Native Americans, the Native Americans are going to be the ones who are the most hurt by this, by the loss of the middle ground between France and England. I got a message here saying you can't hear when I go to my computer screen, I will try to fix that. So let me see here. So for you guys, if you found that there were any questions that I wasn't able to answer, I'll flash a picture if we have anything that needs to be shown, and I'll try to figure out how to fix that for the next time. I think I've got an idea for how to get that done, but we'll get that fixed. So restate any sort of questions that you guys have on the page that I got cut off for, and I'll be able to help you out. Let me see. How was Georgia affected as a buffer between the Spanish and the colonists after the French and Indian War? After the French and Indian War, Georgia is just going to keep growing, and so it will still be threatened by the Spanish. But eventually, once the American Revolution happens, everything's going to flip, and so the Spanish and the French are going to eventually become our allies during the American Revolution. Ben Franklin's going to be working very actively to get them on our team. As a foreshadowing of where we're going with the Battle of Saratoga, it's going to be the turning point of the war where the French and the Spanish are going to want to join with the Americans against the British. Let me see here. Would you say the presence of soldiers along the proclamation were one of the main reasons that caused the war for independence? It is one of the things that made the colonists mad, and it's going to be something that the king is going to need to pay for through taxation. And so all the stuff you're about to read about in Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, where there's soldiers in the New World that the colonists are being told are there for their protection, but more and more it seems like the colonists are there to more form a police state, whether it's forming the line of the Proclamation line of 1763, or else when the colonists become more rebellious, the king is going to take the guys on the Proclamation line and move them further east. You're going to have people stationed in Boston. And the argument that they're in Boston to protect the colonists against the French doesn't make any sense because the French are gone. It doesn't make sense that they're there to help out against the Native Americans because the Native Americans have been gone since the Pequot War and King Philip's War in the 1600s. So a century later, to say we need to have a bunch of redcoats sitting in Boston is going to be really hard for them to take. And so it's one of those many things that's going to tear apart the unity that the British and the colonists are going to have because the colonists feel like they're being lied to about why the redcoats are there. Let me see here. Doesn't matter anymore. Not sure what that means. Why did the Puritan religion begin to decline in the early 1800s? Sorry, early 18th century. The Puritan faith is going to be built around the idea that you're purifying the Anglican Church. So remember in the early chapters, you had these Puritans that were over in England working inside the new church that Henry VIII had created to try to make it a more pure church that moved away from Catholicism. That's going to fail, though, and so the Puritans are going to come over here in 1630 during the Great Puritan Migration. The problem, though, is after a century of living here, a lot of the people in America have no concerns about purifying the English church. They're never going to go to England. They've never been to England. And so the idea of staying true to that Puritan idea is starting to soften. A lot of them are starting to rethink what their religious foundation is now that they are Americans, not British. And they don't have to fight that fight anymore. And so that's why the Puritans are starting to weaken. Who was John Rolfe and what did he do? John Rolfe is the guy who was in the Chesapeake colony from Chapter 2, I believe, who introduced tobacco for them to start growing. What happened during October 17th to 27th, 1987? Oh, the St. Louis Cardinals played in a World Series. Was that it? I think that's it. Yeah, they were in another one of those World Series where sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but it's just nice to be there. Let me see here. God bless you on your response to for the Captain America Iron Man question. Thank you. I'm afraid that when he dies, I'm probably going to weep openly in the movie theater, and that'll cause a lot of sadness. Spoiler alert. Sorry about that. Let me see here. What are the major differences between the 17th century colonial America and the 18th century? So 1600s to the 1700s. 1600s is just that initial experience that you saw, colonies getting started, trying to figure out what they're growing, just very, very small settlements that are being created, and they're just trying to get a toehold and move Native American resistance out of the way. And you see the start of social discord that's happening between the colonists and the colonists who have been there for a while, who are on the upper crust, and the people who are on the lower end of the spectrum. In the 1700s, you have waves of more and more immigrants who are following in the original immigrants, and so you're having a more socially diverse set of people. You're going to see the rise of bigger cities like the Bostons and the New Yorks and the Philadelphias, but you're still going to have a group of people who are heavily focused on farming. They're becoming much more literate, and so like you saw socially, you have the rise of the Enlightenment, the First Great Awakening. People are starting to challenge authority with like the Zenger trial, and with salutary neglect, the colonists are starting to become a little bit richer, a little bit more stabilized, and they're a little bit more questioning over being loyal to the king because they keep getting involved in European land wars that seem like they get nothing for the colonists. And where they had that feeling before the French and Indian War, they really have it afterwards, where that proclamation line stops anybody from moving out west to take advantage of that Ohio River Valley land that they're interested in. Can I explain how Reese Isaac thought that the Great Awakening could pull the colonies apart? I can't speak to him specifically, but I mean, the biggest concern that they had was that old lights, new lights division, where you had a group of people who were stable in their religions who are suddenly torn apart by that. And so you've got whole communities that have this division happening where their one previous church is now being subdivided into two, and the groups that thought that they were so united with one another are no longer. And so that's causing some social tension in the 1700s about what that means for their religious faiths. It's the reason why we've got such diversity with our Christian denominations here inside the United States nowadays. And it's going to get worse as we move into the 1800s, because as you get closer to the Civil War, the issue of slavery is going to split many of them into like Northern and Southern Baptist churches. So you're going to have another subdivision coming in the mid-1800s. Red P is mentioned on page 84, first column near the bottom. I'll take a look at that in just a second. Do we have a test on Tuesday? Yes, that is your physical geography test. I asked you to take a look online at the physical geography memorization test folder. There's a primer that's going on with that test, so you can watch the video for how to get prepared for that. It's a memorization test where you're going to get 3 opportunities to take that test. Each of them is worth 20 points. Your best score out of 3 is what stands up. And so for the one on Tuesday, do your best, see how you do, try out some of the materials I've got online, and hopefully we can get a perfect score on that so we can help bring up your grades if you are having some struggles right now. Let me see. Can I go over the significance of the Scotch-Irish Great Wagon Road? With the Great Wagon Road, you've got this road moving through the Appalachian Mountains that's allowing people who are far, far away from water networks to be able to trade with one another using Conestoga wagons. So instead of sitting on their farm just being subsistence farmers, which means they're just growing enough food to feed themselves, they are trying to figure out some more sort of ways to make additional money or get the other additional things that they need to live from their neighbors that can move along that road. For the Scotch-Irish, remember also they remove themselves from the coastline because they do not want to be close to the British, who they see as abusers. Let me see. Do the letters in the snake for join or die represent a colony's name? Yes, they do. That's going to be what's the importance of happening is what's happening in there. Why did the Anglican Church suffer in colonial America? It only suffered in certain parts that were filled with Protestants who hated the Anglican Church. And so if you were in a location that was like predominantly Catholic, they would have problems with Anglicans. Same thing with Puritans, because remember, they were trying to purify the Anglican Church and saw them as evil. And so they would have problems with them as well. Will you describe the attitude that the British and the colonists had for each other after the French and Indian War? Yes. So after the French and Indian War, 1763, we are not on the verge of an American Revolution yet. If the king would have been nicer to the colonists and gone back to salutary neglect, they could have been a big, happy family. And in fact, when we get to the American Revolution, for the first year of the Revolution, there's a lot of historians who claim that the war was not like a revolution. It was more like a conservative backlash, where people wanted to go back to the old ways of doing things rather than it being some sort of radical new idea for how government should work. We're going to start shooting at each other in 1775. The Declaration of Independence is not going to come until the middle of 1776. And it's with that document that they have a radical rethinking of what our government should be, with the idea of all men being created equal, democratic government, and so on. That's where things start radicalizing themselves. Can I review important parts of the French and Indian War that we need to know? Remember, we talk about the idea of How did it get started? Braddock's attack in the Ohio River Valley. We look for turning points, so Pitt's decision to focus in the New World, the conquering of Quebec, the conquering of Fort Duquesne, and then turning at the ending is the Treaty of Paris. And so then you look for short and long-term results afterwards. The short-term result is the king is deeply in debt. He's going to start charging the colonists taxes. He creates the Proclamation Line of 1763 because Pontiac Rebellion is going on the frontier, but also there are people who are suspicious that he wants to keep the land for himself. And so that's going to be the crucial elements that's going on with the French and Indian War. Can I go over salutary neglect? Sure. Salutary neglect is the idea that the king during the 1600s and 1700s, outside of some rare instances like the Dominion of New England, is largely allowing the colonists to run themselves. He thinks he's got a great handle on the colonies with like his navigation acts, mercantilism, his royal governors, but like we've seen, the royal governors are ineffective. They aren't allowed to get stuff done on their own, and they have to depend on the legislatures in the colonies to run things. So where the king thinks he's in total control, the reality is the colonists largely have independence because the king is neglecting the fact that they've been given freedom to do pretty much whatever they want to as long as they don't make the king mad. And so that salutary neglect is going to be ended after the French and Indian War, where the king is going to start demanding taxes, and the colonists are going to talk about taxation with representation. They want to keep taxing themselves to build things for themselves. They don't want to send huge amounts of money over to England when they are pretty much sure that none of that money is ever going to come back to them in a way that they would want and need. Who is John Singleton Copley, and what did he do? He's not hugely important for this chapter. Give me just a second. As you can see with the Google search that I just did with you guys, he's an American artist during the time period who is creating paintings of people's portraits, and it's an early indication of what artwork looked like during this time period. When they mention art in your textbook, make note of it, especially noticing trends that are taking place, but it's not going to become a fundamental element of massive numbers of our questions that are going to be on the test. How do the wars that didn't take place in America such affect the colonies? The colonies are an extension of their mother country, and so with England and France, when they go to war, they all go to war. So even though the French are here in the Americas, they are technically at war with whoever the French are going to war with. And remember, the New World is seen as a place where natural resources can come from, which can aid in the war effort. And so by being able to attack the source of natural resources that could aid in the war effort, you are helping ultimately your country to be able to win a war. Let's see here. Why are pioneer presses important? Pioneer presses are important because of the fact that you've got printing presses in almost every colony, and so these small kind of farmer backwater kind of places, at least that's the way that's seen by the Europeans, are actually highly literate places that are very much into the idea of freedom of speech, gathering as much information as they can. They're deeply influenced by the Enlightenment and also the First Great Awakening religious movement. And so it's going to be a very important thing for the pioneer presses, with the fact that as they set up this network of newspaper publishing, it's going to also then be the tool that's used during the path of the American Revolution to spread all sorts of things propaganda-wise about the king to be inflammatory. And if they're able to spread that information around, they can hopefully get people mobilized to be able to fight in the war effort. So give me 1 second. I'll check out that question about the red letter. Find my textbook. My textbook is out in my car, so I'll need to answer your question about the red letter when you come to class tomorrow. I'll be able to research it. It's not a vital part of what's going to be on your test, if it's even one of the questions. I can't remember it being on there, so it's not a crucial element that you need to worry about. Let me see, Batman or Superman, who is better? Did you see that most recent movie? They both were terrible. I mean, that was awful. I don't know what DC is doing with their movie stuff, but it's not good. Now, those old like Christian Bale movies where he's like, I am Batman. I mean, that's pretty cool. But I mean, like Superman versus Batman. Batman has no powers. Why didn't Superman just fly him up to the upper atmosphere and just be done with him? Who was William Pitt, and what do we need to know about him? William Pitt, like I mentioned, he's the Prime Minister of England during the French and Indian War, and he decides to concentrate his forces in the New World to try to end the French as a threat to the to the English colonies, and he's successful in doing that. That's why Fort Duquesne is renamed Pittsburgh in his honor for being able to accomplish that. And that's the question just came in. Why was William Pitt known as the organizer for victory? That's his key. He puts his efforts into the New World, takes his navy, blocks off the St. Lawrence River, meticulously goes through and takes over the major cities that the French have built up, and removes them as a threat. What was Poor Richard's Almanac? That was written by Ben Franklin. It's a book that's put out every year. Still nowadays it's put out. And an almanac is essentially a prediction of what the weather is going to be like, highs and lows in the past. And it's used by farmers to try to figure out best times to plant, best times to harvest, using information beyond just reading the weather to understand that in the past this is what the weather has been doing. What made Poor Richard's Almanac so popular is the fact that he would also slip in like jokes, stories, other sorts of things that help to educate farmers in the New World with other things beyond just farmer knowledge. And so that's the reason why it was such a vital and important thing. It's still around nowadays. I don't see any other sorts of questions. I think we're going to wrap up at this point unless anybody's got anything else that comes flying in really quickly. Cubs Cardinals are playing on TV, so if you want to see what playoff teams look like, I know that Twins fans, that's not that was low. But if you want to check it out, I know the Cubs are going to the playoffs. I'm hoping the Cardinals do, but we've won so much lately that even if the Cardinals don't get there, I'll be all right. I'll be a fan in the fall, in the spring, and it'll be okay. Let me see. If we get 100% on the test Tuesday, do we have to take the other 2 ones? Nope. What key strategic tool did the Indians lose as a result of the war's outcome and the Treaty of Paris? They lost France. And so that middle ground doesn't work out anymore because of the fact that they don't have the French to play off against the British. And the British are going to really become not very trustful of what the Indians were up to, especially when they see that after the war is done, the Pontiac's rebellion is still being heavily encouraged by the French, who are still living in the area even though they lost, that they're trying to figure out ways to encourage the French to still keep attacking the British even though the war's over. Transportation Act of 1718, that was that nasty law I told you about where they were transporting criminals across the ocean so that they could come settle here instead of populating the British jails. All right, well, that's 1 hour. Hopefully that helped you out some. Like I mentioned, this will be archived, and so if you want to check this out later or review it again, the link will be able to work for you. Also, feel free to email if you've got questions later on this evening, or else feel free to buzz in before the test gets started tomorrow. When you walk into class, just drop off your notebooks on my desk. I will also have available for you electronic drop-off spots for you to be able to put your notes into when you come to class tomorrow. I wish you all the best. I hope tomorrow goes well for you. Keep in mind, our final grades aren't until January, and so if you are still really stressed out, sometimes these tests are things that can really bring kids down. We got a lot of time to work with. If you keep turning in your work, we've got things built in to keep your grades safe. And even if your test scores don't turn until like January, February, March, if you keep turning in all of your stuff and have it be authentically yours and you pass the AP test in the spring, you guys are going to be good. It says here, let him watch the Cards lose to my Cubs. Wow. It's got to feel like dirty and wrong to like be a Cubs fan. And if you're like a fair weather brand new Cubs fan, that's sad. Because, I mean, they were cursed by a goat. Look up goat curse Cubs, and it's sadness that people in that town actually believe a man with a goat put a curse on them so they can't win World Series games. It's tragic. So, anyway, have a good night. It was good working with you guys. Hopefully this helped you out. If you need anything else, please let me know. But I'm pulling for you. I hope you guys do well. And just for turning up on a Sunday night to be doing this sort of stuff, that's huge. You guys are acting like college students, and that's exactly what I want from you. So good luck tonight. I'm hoping you do well. Let me know if I can help you out. Good night.